Our topic tonight has to do with terrorism, radicalization, and Islamic extremism in the United States. A theme which is pressed upon our minds constantly, most recently because of the Portland experience, hugely by 9/11 and by a variety of incidents since. And there's no doubt that terrorism does terrorize us. You look at the airlines and what you have to go through, all of which is a response to this. So terrorism on some scale is psychologically affecting us. It's a huge problem for us, major national security issue. However, it's a puzzle as to what the role of Islam or the so-called Islamic extremists is within this. And so it remains a kind of a great interest as to what is this pattern of terrorism, how extensive is it within the United States, and how does it operate, and what are the appropriate measures to use with respect to it. All of us have notions about that particular puzzle. Our speaker tonight has immersed himself in these questions for a long time, probably for a quarter of a century in the national security questions. A graduate of Brown University and a holder of a Master of Arts degree in sociology from Brown. He worked as a member of the staff for the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate. He worked for the distinguished Senator Frank Church of Idaho. He worked for the New Republic, for U.S. News and World Report, some of the major networks, and studying these issues, and the result of which is over a number of years, a half a dozen books, co-authored numerous articles exploring a variety of the questions of international terrorism. One of the most striking things he did was produce a documentary, Jihad, in the United States, which was on public television. Shortly after that, he founded the Investigative project on terrorism, which he still serves as the executive director. It has acquired a monumental resource for the investigation of these questions, an ongoing and active research organization. He's testified, as you all know, before numerous committees of Congress, and at one he testified in 1998, I believe, about the threat of international terrorism, and Osama bin Laden in particular, and has since then remained, as I said, an active student of these matters. Now, recognized authority as he is, his work has not been without controversy, as you know, and questions have been raised from a variety of dimensions, but this particular puzzle of terrorism and its Islamic forms gets enmeshed in all of our sensitivities about ethnicity and race and values in the United States, which complicates the discussion. But in any case, with that simply alluded to, let me say that we have one of the nation's truly ranking authorities on this issue, a man who's taken these matters seriously for a long time. We're absolutely delighted that he's with us. He's part of a long tradition of this council of looking at both sides of issues, and we've looked at the Arab-Israeli business for a long time. We've had representatives of most of the Arab states. We've had 13 of Israel's ambassadors to the United States address the council. We've had some people here who have been very friendly to the Arab world, and we have had some which are harsh critics. Within that context, and underlining the importance of trying to get a better grasp of the nature and extent of terrorism in the United States, it's an enormous pleasure to present Mr. Stephen Emerson.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, I sort of feel like Elizabeth Taylor's seventh husband must have felt on his wedding night. I know what to do, but how do I make it interesting? All right. Sorry if that's a little bit X-rated. I deal in the intelligence arena, and as you know, sometimes the intelligence gets it wrong, especially when it goes from agency to agency. And it reminds me of the game of telephone that kids play. When one kid passes a piece of information to the second kid, by the 10th kid it changes dramatically. And the story conjures up a story I had heard about a young monk who joins an order, and his first assignment is to copy the copies of the scriptures, as has been done every year since the order was founded hundreds of years ago. So the young monk thinks for a second and goes to the senior monk and says, you know what? If I copy the copies and there's a mistake, I'm only going to be replicating the mistake. Why don't I copy the original scriptures? So the senior monk thinks for a second and says, that's a wonderful idea. I'm going to go down in the vault and check the original scriptures against the copies. So the senior monk goes down to the vault, an hour, 2, 3, 4 elapsed, he doesn't appear. So the junior monk goes down to look for him. As he gets closer to the vault, he hears this crying, this sobbing, this wailing. And he sees the senior monk poured over, just crying his eyes out over the original scriptures, and asks him, what's the problem? And the senior monk responds, the word was celebrate. I realized I probably would have had a better career as a comedian than as a terror analyst. Well, I think Dr. Bird raised most of the seminal questions, the sensitivities of the issue of radical Islamic terrorism. Even the term itself is subject to a lot of controversy. As you know, many leaders in the current administration and in the former administration refused to even use the term radical Islam, saying that that would denigrate an entire religion, and therefore the only term they would use would be violent extremism or militant extremism, without conveying which type of extremism it really was. And this is all wrapped up in the whole notion of political correctness, as well as religious sensitivities, and everything else that attends to the discussion of radical Islam. I make no bones about it. I say what it is, whether it's Jewish extremism or Jewish terrorists or Catholic terrorists or Christian militia. I use the term radical Islam or Islamic terrorists, not to demean or convey the notion that all Muslims are terrorists or radical, far from that, but to convey the notion that those who I am referring to are acting out of a motivation derived from their interpretation of Islam or the interpretation that's been conveyed to them. Now, let me step back for a second and tell you how I got into this business and try to figure a way out. I got into it because I was a correspondent for CNN in 1992, and I was sent to Oklahoma City on December 24th, 1992, to cover an event that was unfolding. And it was slowly unfolding, so I was told to park myself by my editors and wait. And so on Christmas Day, 1992, I had nothing to do, so I took my rented car and drove to downtown Oklahoma City. And there, when I passed the Oklahoma City Convention Center, I saw hundreds, if not thousands, of people streaming out of the convention center, dressed in Middle Eastern garb, long robes, headscarves, and other such clothing that I had recognized as purely and distinctly Middle Eastern. But it was very strange for me to see all of these people in Oklahoma City on Christmas Day in the United States. And my first reaction, to tell you the truth, was these must be extras working on a film. So I went inside the convention center, and I discovered, to my utter surprise and astonishment, that they were not extras, but that, in fact, a radical Islamic conference under the acronym MAYA, the Muslim Arab Youth Association, which I had never heard of, was holding one of its annual conferences, and featured were leaders of the top terrorist groups in the world. And on the auditorium floor were scores of rectangular tables where radical Islamic groups, the ones that I had read about or seen on television, but never had experience in person in the United States, were selling their wares, including the Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the Algerian Islamic Salvation Front, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jamaat Islamiyah. All of these groups were giving away tapes or pamphlets or books, some in Arabic, some in English. What was my first reaction was when I looked at the back of these pamphlets, I saw that they were published in the United States, and their centers were in different cities, from Boston to Oklahoma City, to Tampa, to Chicago, to Los Angeles, to San Diego. And I realized at that moment that there was a serious national security problem insofar as all of these radical Islamic groups now had a presence in the United States, and no one knew about it. And that was confirmed to me when I went down to the bank of elevators on the 3rd floor and called up one of the top officials in the FBI to ask him about whether there was any reporting about the presence of radical Islamic leaders or a radical Islamic conference. A conference, by the way, under Maya that turned out to be a direct creation of Al-Qaeda. And I called his office, didn't get an answer, and then I went to the FBI switchboard, asked her to switch me through to his home, and she, grilled me on whether it was a national security issue. I said yes, so she finally patched me through to this official's home, and he was rather perturbed to be, disturbed by me again. I usually do it 363 days a year. And I asked him, are you aware of what is going on here in Oklahoma City with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Islamic Jihad having a presence, and almost every other radical Islamic group? He says, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, you're not aware there's no cable traffic suggesting or revealing the fact that people flew in and that there's a conference here? He said, Steve, I don't know what you've been smoking, but whatever you have been smoking is leading you to be delusional. And that was the extent of the conversation, being very frustrated because here I'd witnessed something, and he was denying the very existence of it. And in fact, later that night, I went to a special presentation called Palestine Night, where the head of Hamas, Khalid Mashal, a head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Kamal Hilbawi, who I had studied for years, but were there live and present and talking about killing Jews and carrying out jihad in America. And I was in a section, actually, for converts where there was simultaneous translation. And I recorded it all. And I again, was just astonished by what I had witnessed. And I came back to Washington and proposed to CNN that we do a story about the presence of radical Islamic groups on American soil. And their reaction was, well, we'll check with the FBI. Of course, the FBI said there's nothing there. So CNN said, we're not going to do the story. Well, I was very frustrated, obviously. I knew something was there, but I couldn't get it on the air. And then 2 months later, something happened that changed my life and certainly changed the life of a lot of prosecutors, but it didn't change the lives of many Americans. It was the first World Trade Center bombing on February 26, 1993, that killed, quote, only 7 people. Because it was only 7 people, it was treated as if it was just a criminal conspiracy by which 17 defendants were prosecuted and then convicted. Under the leadership of great prosecutors such as Pat Fitzgerald, who's now the U.S. Attorney in Chicago, Andrew McCarthy, and other prosecutors. They did a great job. But when I say me, myself and an intern began looking at the court exhibits, we saw thousands of telephone toll records by the 17 defendants all over the world in the previous year and a half. At that point, toll records were not digitized. And we couldn't figure out, there was no way of figuring out who they were. So we actually tried an experiment, which was to dial up at night all the Middle East phone numbers. And I had several Arabic volunteers, Muslims actually, who were helping me. They were on loan from the New York District Attorney's Office. And they would call these phone numbers blindly and try to engage the person at the other end. Well, we only succeeded in about 10 or 15% of the more than 2,000 telephone toll numbers to the Middle East. But of that 10 to 15%, we hit gold on about half of them, including known terrorists, including the blind sheikh's son, the blind sheikh's brother, including Hamas members, We also called in the United States to places like Ruston, Louisiana, where we found the head of USA Hamas living there. So I realized after several months that the 1993 bombing was not just a 17-member law enforcement conspiracy problem, but rather a movement, and that many more knew of this attack than we could prove. And therefore, I had an inside track, considering my experience in Oklahoma City, on the development of radical Islam in the U.S. CNN asked me to do a documentary about the World Trade Center bombing in February, but asked me to focus on Afghanistan, offering to send me there to focus on, quote, the issue of blowback. Blowback being the concept of how the United States aided the Mujahideen in the 1980s to get rid of the Soviets, but then turn their ire on the U.S., blowback. I said that's an important part of the story, but the real news story is how these groups have been able to disappear and reappear under new incarnation in the United States, under nobody's attention, under the radar screen, and that this is the same spectrum of radical Islam that had been deviling us in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And I proposed to them a documentary that would look at the different cities in the U.S. and the groups that were located. Islamic Jihad in Chicago, Islamic Jihad in Chicago, St. Louis, as well as Tampa. Hamas in Tucson, Culver City, and Los Angeles, as well as Palos Heights, Illinois. Jamaat Islamiyah in San Diego. I mean, all over the country, I said, we should investigate this. And their reaction was, no, we're not going to approve it. And they never told me why officially, but I finally found an editor who's told me unofficially they're not going to approve it because it's too, quote, politically sensitive, which was interesting concept for me as a journalist, since I didn't think that belonged as the criteria for deciding what should be broadcast. Well, hell has no fury like a journalist scorned. I quit. And I got some seed money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I went over to Pakistan and Afghanistan, spent 4 months there, in the hosted by a family, a Mujahideen family, whose father had been killed in 1989, but who was the mentor to Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Azam. And I even went to Jalalabad for 2 weeks, which is a city in southern Afghanistan, waiting to meet Osama bin Laden. But he never showed up, and I, being the softy I was, could not adjust to the 32-degree water, the lack of bottled water that was clean, and the fact that there was no heat in the hotel in the wintertime. So I left, to my great chagrin later on. I ended up getting videotapes from my hosts in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a present, as a goodbye present. When I came back to the U.S. and popped those video cassettes into the VCR, it was startling what I saw. They were conferences under different names and acronyms of radical Islamic groups throughout the United States. Kansas City, Los Angeles, Boston, Massachusetts, Brooklyn, Tampa, Florida, St. Louis. And I realized then I had my documentary. And so I produced a documentary called Jihad in America that aired on PBS in November 1994. And it got some major awards, but it still wasn't taken seriously because, as one New York Times critic said, Mr. Emerson has exposed fiery rhetoric by religious leaders, but there's no evidence of a threat. And I suspect, by the way, that if I had done the similar documentary on the Ku Klux Klan, the reaction would have been quite different. Having said that, I realized that having done the documentary, I started getting phone calls from law enforcement and from the media about different groups operating around the country. And there was no central repository where this information could be found. So I founded a group called the Investigative Project on Terrorism that would literally collect documentation, go undercover into radical conferences around the United States, tape record what was going on, and have a true record of the documentation, the incorporation, the existence of these groups, and what they said behind closed doors. And I did that from 1995 to 2011, but with great difficulty because there was a lack of funding, and everybody thought I was crazy, including my mother. And I still believed in it, but it was harder and harder to get up every morning and say this is happening when everybody else was saying, no, you're being histrionic. And then, of course, 9/11/2001 happened, and suddenly I was transformed into a, quote, Cassandra. And my reaction was, I'm not a Cassandra. I was not a Cassandra. I simply looked at the material and saw what was going on. I was good at doing that because it was a necessary part of investigation. And the people who didn't do that were not doing their job, and that's why I looked good. But I was only doing my job. And then we began monitoring more and more groups around the United States, to the point today where we have an archival base of intelligence data that is one of the largest open source data centers in the world on radical Islam, comprising 5 million documents, 30 to 40,000 hours of undercover video and audio, and umpteen terabytes. Now, this information is used for various purposes. We have a website, and if you're interested in subscribing to our emails, just give me your business card later. But the website now has tens of thousands of followers, and it posts investigative pieces almost every day about different groups. We also have a wing that does not become public, and I only describe it in general. It works with the government, and it works on cases, prosecutions, indictments. It works on deportation, asset forfeitures. I can tell you, for example, that after 9/11, when the president froze 11 charitable fronts as terrorist organizations, we played a key role in providing the open source intelligence to justify that according to U.S. law, because the CIA, which held classified information about these groups, wouldn't release that information to the administration for fear of jeopardizing its sources and methods. We actually had the open source information that could be used. And we've been working with law enforcement ever since. Now, here's the issues we faced, and the issue and the discussion about which I hope we'll have a larger one after I finish speaking. The reality is that today, radical Islam, or the term, has become has become part of a political football. People in this administration and in the previous administration have issued memorandum saying you are not allowed to use the term radical Islam. You can only use the term violent extremism. In fact, there are those in this administration, including the National Security Advisor, John Brennan, who made a speech this past year saying jihad doesn't mean holy war, it just means peaceful struggle. And while jihad does have two meanings, holy war is certainly one of the major meanings. And that is a statement not made by Steve Emerson, but made by Islamic advisors and religious leaders all over the world. And it's been in effect since the days of Muhammad. Now, of course, there is a peaceful jihad, but those who aspire to destroy a Christmas parade in Portland, Oregon, or to blow up the New York World Trade Center, or to carry out a bombing in Dallas, or any one of the more than 160 Islamic plots and attempts that have been stopped, several not since 9/11, are all under the rubric of radical Islam. Does it mean all Muslims carry out terrorism? Far from it. Does it mean that there is a percentage of those within the community? Yes. And what is their belief? Their belief stems from a philosophy, a more modern philosophy, that was articulated by a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was created in the 1920s in Egypt by a man named Hassan al-Banna. And his movement was to stop the secularization of Islamic and Middle Eastern countries by the colonial powers and return those Islamic countries to the fundamentals of Islam, so that they would institute the Sharia, the Code of Islamic Law, which is called for the stoning of women, amputation of limbs, and all types of draconian punishments to anybody who defects from Islam, as well as for Islam to reign supreme. In fact, they call the world divided into two spheres, Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Harb is the house of war, where Islam doesn't reign supreme and you're allowed to wage war to impose Islam, and Dar al-Islam, where Islam reigns supreme and there's peace. And their mission is supremacist, which is that Islam will conquer the world. That's not me stating it. These are the purveyors and leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, including a man named Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, based in Qatar, but who has issued many fatwas, or religious decrees, calling for the killing of Americans and Jews, not just Israelis, but Jews, and also has called for draconian attacks on American interests around the world. He is the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1995, I attended another Islamic conference in Toledo, Ohio, where Qaradawi was the speaker, the main speaker, and he openly called for jihad to take over the United States and jihad to retake Spain, because Spain, you know, was conquered by Islam 1,000 years ago and then evicted in 1492. So they consider Spain Andalusia part of the Islamic Empire. And they said they would take over the United States, not through the jihad of the sword, but through jihad of dawah, D-A-W-A. What does that mean? Proselytization, conversion, infiltration. I call it a legal insurgency. And in fact, one of the most important documents that has come, that has been declassified and found by U.S. law enforcement authorities since the Pumpkin Papers was a document found in 2006 in Maryland in the home of a Hamas activist named Ismail el-Barassi. And the document, along with tens of thousands of others, were in Arabic and then translated. These documents recorded the actual structure, the secret structure of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, all the secret memberships, the dues, the captains, the majors, as well as the different groups who were secretly members of this organization. And their motto was to take over this country. And I'm going to read to you one of the most important documents in this collection that was introduced in a trial held of Hamas fundraisers in 2007. And the document read, "Understanding the Role of the Muslim Brother, member of Muslim in North America." Here are the operative words. "The process of settlement is a, quote, civilization jihadist process with all the word means. The Ikhwan, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood, must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions." That was one of the most important documents because for the first time, law enforcement and the intelligence community learned of the existence of this Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy in the United States, the vast extent to which it existed for years since 1991, and the role and mission that this organization and movement had to play secretly. In other words, this was an organization that didn't necessarily believe in jihad of the sword, but they believed in jihad of penetration, sabotage, infiltration. And that they found to be ultimately the best way of changing this government and ultimately, in their minds, making it an Islamic government. And when I talk about this, people say, well, you know, Steve, this is conspiratorial. I mean, how do we know this is really happening? Well, I refer to documentation. It's on our website as well as in the Department of Justice's many trials against members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were members of terrorist groups. Just look at the deception perpetrated by the dozens of radical Islamic charities that operated in the United States from the late 1980s till 2001. All named with very, very benign-sounding names like Benevolence International, Global Relief, the Islamic Association for Palestine, the Islamic Committee for Palestine. None of them had the words in it, Muslim Brotherhood, deliberately, to avoid any suspicion cast upon them. But in fact, all of them were derived and created by the Muslim Brotherhood as fronts in the United States, not only to raise money for charity, that was their ostensible cause, but to secretly form conduits to support suicide bombings and terrorism, and also to provide a legitimacy for radical members of the Muslim Brotherhood to operate in the United States and to get green cards and passports. And these groups operated relatively uninterfered with for about 14 years, raising collectively a total of more than $500 million tax-free, care of the U.S. taxpayer, that went to radical Islamic movements in the world. Outside of us, much of it going to suicide bombers or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations. And it was only until after 9/11 that we woke up. I say we, the government woke up and saw that there was a real problem here, and was finally had the motivation and the political sanction to crack down on these groups, and immediately shut down close to 20 radical Islamic groups, seizing their assets on the grounds that they were fronts for terrorism. Again, this was the modus operandi of these organizations. To this day, there are scores, I can't even give you the number, of organizations in the United States that falsely claim to be civil rights groups, that routinely hurl the charge Islamophobia, that claim to be moderate by saying they condemn terrorism, but in fact are arms or derived from the Muslim Brotherhood. For example, the organization called the Council on American-Islamic Relations, one of the most popular Muslim Brotherhood groups in the United States today, over 32 chapters, was created directly from a Hamas meeting held in Philadelphia in 1993 that was wiretapped by the FBI, in which the leaders of Hamas at that point discussed the need for a PR firm or organization to promote the interest of Hamas in the United States, because they found that Hamas wasn't selling well as Hamas. And they created a group in the following year called the Council on American-Islamic Relations, and it was a Hamas front. And yet, they started to appear routinely on television shows, being interviewed in newspapers. And despite many of my warnings and my testimonies in Congress in the 90s, none of that was taken seriously or paid attention to in terms of my providing the actual evidence that the Council on American-Islamic Relations was a front group for Hamas. And we actually had tape recordings of what they did behind closed doors, including featured speakers from the Muslim Brotherhood calling for the killing of all Jews and Americans, featuring Holocaust deniers, all types of radical statements. And yet that wasn't enough, apparently. Even to this day, Council on American-Islamic Relations, despite the fact that the FBI formally broke off relations with CAIR in December 2008, was described as a front for Hamas in the Holy Land case in 2007 by a special agent of the FBI, and who was called and who was linked to Hamas by the FBI in a letter to that organization saying, we will no longer have contact with you because you are associated and have links to Hamas. So the FBI courageously broke off ties by calling it what it was. And yet, to this day, you will see spokesmen and officials of CAIR appear on television or interviewed in the New York Times as leaders of moderate civil rights groups. That would be akin to calling David Duke a civil rights leader. We would never get away with it. And yet, these groups get a pass. And sometimes they don't, but most of the times they do, because they're very aggressive in claiming that any attack on CAIR is somehow an attack on Islam. A comparison that I roundly reject as a slur against moderate Muslims, because CAIR wants to erase the distinction between radical Islam and moderate Islam, and thereby creating a situation where if you criticize radical Islam, according to CAIR, you're criticizing Islam. Not so. In all of my speeches in 16 years, in all of my writings and hundreds of articles and testimonies, I've always made the distinction between moderate Islam and radical Islam. And yet, in this day and age of incredible technology, of personalized information flows, radical Islam is one of the fastest growing militant movements in the world. And I wonder sometimes, how is it that they are still growing in the United States so fast? Remember that in the last 3 years, there were more attempted attacks in the United States by radical Muslims acting on their own than there were in the previous 7 years since 9/11, including Major Nidal Hassan, the psychiatrist from Walter Reed Hospital, who ended up killing 13 people on Fort Hood base a year and a half ago, and he was yelling Allahu Akbar. He was in contact with Anwar al-Awlaki, the radical al-Qaeda cleric in Yemen. And yet, while he was at Walter Reed, his colleagues noticed that he was taking up the cause of radical Islam, trying to convert his patients to radical Islam, issuing PowerPoints, justifying the killing of Americans. And no one complained to the FBI. Not a single person complained. Why? Because they were all afraid of being tagged a racist. And because of that political inhibition and the intimidation that they perceived would occur, this man got away with killing 13 people and is now on trial. And he's tried on 13 counts of capital murder, but not tried on terrorism. Why? Because politically, the administration did not want to use the word terrorism in describing his acts. I find these types of examples of the fear of using terminology to be utterly not just embarrassing, but counterproductive. Because if we genuinely want moderates to succeed, we have to disassociate, disempower, and delegitimize radical Muslim organizations, which unfortunately have a monopoly in the Muslim world in terms of centers of religious authority, in centers of communication like Al Jazeera, in centers of education, in centers of all types of media. They dominate. They don't necessarily reflect everyone's views, but they dominate. There's no alternative view of radical Islam like a view proposed by Zuhdi Jasser, who is an incredibly pious but genuinely moderate Islamic leader from Phoenix, Arizona, who served for 20 years as a Navy surgeon, and he was born in Syria. He doesn't get the attention he needs. Instead, it's groups like CARE, it's groups like the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC. Again, sounds like a nice generic name, an innocent-sounding organization. But in fact, MPAC and CARE and all these other Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups have been issued one theme in common to all of them for the last umpteen number of years that they've been in existence. And what is that one common theme? That there's a war against Islam, that it's a conspiracy perpetrated by the United States, the West, the Jews, the Christians, and therefore the United States and the West and Jews and Christians are responsible for the fact that Islam is in the low end of the totem pole it is politically today. Now, why is that? Because in the last battle between the West and Islamic armies at the gates of Vienna, the Muslim armies lost and retreated. And they retreated into a shell that didn't allow the Western cultural revolutions to permeate. So there was no Age of Enlightenment, there was no Renaissance, there was no secularization, separation of church and state, there was no Industrial Revolution, there was no pluralism. All of that remained outside the Islamic realm, to the point that 10 years ago, the Grand Imam of Saudi Arabia kept insisting religiously that the world was flat. And if you see the conspiracy theories that come out routinely in the Muslim world today that are translated, fortunately, you will see the most abjectly racist, militant, and incendiary attacks on the West, on Jews and Christians. And that is tolerated, in fact, promoted. And unfortunately, if the center of religious and political gravity is in the hands of the militants, they control what somebody hears from cradle to grave. So it's not something that we should be surprised at, that somebody becomes radicalized by hearing the refrain over and over again that there's a war against Islam. That's a total fabrication, a paranoid conspiracy designed to explain away the fact that Islam doesn't reign supreme. You know the term Allahu Akbar, translated mostly as Allah is great? Doesn't mean Allah is great. It means Allah is greatest, E-S-T. It's a supremacist view, because according to those that in Muslim Brotherhood interpretation, Jews and Christians were corrupted by the Old Testament and New Testament, and only Muslims and the Prophet Muhammad were the genuinely divine, truly authentic religions. And therefore, one does not convert to Islam, believe it or not, one reverts to Islam, because everybody was born a Muslim in the very beginning. This is their view, not mine. And this continues throughout schools in the West, Islamic schools, for example, in France, a new report just came out the other day that was absolutely shocking, showing that upwards of 95% of Islamic French schools still taught the notion that Jews and Christians must be killed. And in the United States, the Saudi Reston Academy, funded by Saudi Arabia, still teaches in its curriculum that Jews and Christians are responsible for the status of Muslims in the world today. So this radicalizing metaphor and conspiracy is the number one component in radicalizing Muslim youth, the number one. And so it's not surprising to see young Muslims like this 19-year-old from Portland and others succumb to the belief that because there is this conspiracy against Muslims and Islam in general that's been going on since 1095, the first year of the Crusades, their reaction is they have to avenge it. And so they look upon these attacks, would-be attacks as well as the 9/11 attacks, as being defensive, avenging the crimes perpetrated against Muslims. And that's the lockhold and monopolistic belief that creates a situation where they become radicalized. How else do you explain in Fort Dix, New Jersey, where up to a dozen Muslims living in the United States for the better part of 20 years, having very successful businesses, being solidly middle class, suddenly deciding one day that they wanted to commit jihad against the U.S. and bomb Fort Dix and kill hundreds of U.S. soldiers? How else do you explain that Muslim youth like this a young man in Portland, Oregon, decided he wanted to commit an act against Christians celebrating Christmas on Christmas Day in Portland, Oregon? How else do you explain the numerous plots by Islamic terrorists who wanted to carry out attacks in Chicago or wanted to carry out attacks on a plane going from Nigeria to the United States last December, or a year ago December, or the New York Times bomber, New York Times Square bomber? That was a Freudian slip, sorry. I'll get to the media in a second. How else explain this? I mean, they're not necessarily being indoctrinated overseas. They're indoctrinated, ironically, here in the West. And we, as a society, fail to recognize that and make the distinction, and we fail to delegitimize them just the way we dealt with the FBI, with the KKK, by delegitimizing the KKK until the point came where it no longer was respectable to accept anybody's position in the KKK. We ran it out of existence. And that's the same thing that should be, that same formula needs to be applied to any extremist group. I don't care what religious group it is. It has to be applied to anyone, to disincentivize them, delegitimize them. So what happened a week ago in Los Angeles? The Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, together with the FBI and the LA District Attorney, hosted a conference for law enforcement only called Radicalization. Its real mission was countering Islamic radicalization, but they didn't want to put that in the title because it was, quote, too inflammatory. So they had radicalization. They featured speakers from those law enforcement agencies on how to counter radicalization. But who were the two outside speakers that they brought in as special experts? Two members of a leading radical Islamist group called MPAC that have consistently spread the word and put out the message that that Islam is under attack by America, and that almost many of the prosecutions and convictions of Islamic terrorists in the United States have been instigated and fabricated by the FBI. In other words, the message that somehow the U.S. is the actual secret instigator of terrorist plots and fabricating all these charges against Muslims and acting as part of a conspiracy, that is, again, the factor that radicalizes Muslims. And yet they were the featured guest speakers at this law enforcement conference. What does this tell us? It tells us something that you'll see in a documentary I'm releasing in 2 months, something I call the Grand Deception. The Grand Deception is about how radical Islamic groups, pretending to be moderate, have become legitimized and wittingly and unwittingly supported by the mainstream media, such as the New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and elsewhere, that have legitimized these groups by calling them moderate, by not identifying their Hamas or Muslim Brotherhood background, by refusing to report on their radical statements as they would report on the KKK or Jewish extremists or the Christian militia. In other words, exonerating them and then allowing them to penetrate their own institutions to the point that the New York Times and the AP today have actual reporters who were trained by the Council on American Islamic Relations. And in law enforcement today, there are local law enforcement agencies, such as the Sheriff of Los Angeles, who have openly invited radical Muslim leaders to serve on counterterrorist advisory boards. Even earlier this year in February, the Department of Homeland Security held a counterterrorism conference held at the very highest levels by Secretary Janet Napolitano. They had 112 people invited from the Muslim community. Almost all of them, or at least a majority of them, were radical, including 6 who had been previously listed as unindicted co-conspirators in a Hamas funding case. So we see now incrementally how these groups have managed to implement this 1991 memorandum to infiltrate, penetrate, to gain power from within. They don't want violence here, actually, although they have support. Their other colleagues, such as Al-Jihad, Al-Qaeda, and other groups, do carry it out. They want to carry out this legal insurgency, which, by the way, is mostly legal. It's not illegal to misrepresent yourself. The FBI doesn't prosecute you if you call yourself a civil rights group and you're really a radical group. It's not illegal, and I dare say I would not support the criminalization of statements such as death to America. That's part of free speech. And there's no institution in the United States that checks the veracity of the claims made by these organizations that they're truly moderate, when in fact we have recorded statements in audio and video routinely, close to 40,000 hours of many of these groups supporting radical Islam, and saying so behind closed doors. And yet, when the subject comes up of talking about radical Islam, or even the 70% of the Americans who said they were opposed to the Ground Zero Mosque, not constitutionally, but just on based on the sensitivities of the families of 9/11, the Islamic groups, Muslim radical groups, got together and started using the term Islamophobia, claiming that anyone who opposed that mosque was an Islamophobe, meaning a racist. I dare say 70% of the American public are not racists. There may be some racism in opposition to some Islamic mosques, but for the most part, this is a very tolerant country. We've been tolerant to all types of minorities. And in fact, our tolerance therein lies our weakness. Because if we don't lie, we don't expect others to lie. If we don't deceive, we don't expect others to deceive. And especially religious groups and religion reporters. I hate to say it, but Islam, unfortunately, because of the radicals, is the only religion that requires a national security reporter to cover it. I say that because there is a vast amount of radical ideology that spawns terrorism around the world based on the kernel of Islam, even though inherently Islam can be anything you make it to be. And that's why there are peaceful Muslims who unfortunately do not get enough attention, who are shunned aside by the government, who do not get money from the Gulf, and are basically powerless. We need them to step up to the plate. We need to empower them, because ultimately the bad guys will win. And then it'll be too late. It'll be too late because you can't unravel the progress made by these Islamic groups in terms of their penetration of law enforcement, the media, social groups, and elsewhere. And they're very good at using technology. So good at it that they have now crafted and perfected the use of social friendly technology to recruit new jihadists all over the world. So we are facing a situation, I'll wrap it up, in which we face the prospect of more acts of radical Islam. Yes, there are other terrorist groups. There are Jewish terrorists, there are Christian terrorists, there are eco-terrorists. But this is the only terrorist genre that has been exempted from having its motivational factor described in its term. In other words, when people say, when the Attorney General says we face a problem of violent extremism, what is he talking about? Eco-terrorism? Is he talking about other types of terrorism? Which terrorist group is he talking about? The only way we can win is to designate and ostracize those radicals from the moderates who want to emerge. And doing so, you need to use the term radical Islam. It's not a denigration of all Muslims, but a term describing the actions and motivations of those who carry out terrorism. And if you can't name your enemy, you can't expect to win. So we face a battle not only by law enforcement, who are facing an uphill battle, because even the arrest the other day of this Oregon man who wanted to blow up Christmas Day parade, new articles today in the New York Times and all over the newspapers around the country have raised the issue of entrapment as something that shouldn't be allowed, and that these Muslim convictions and these Muslim arrests were all based on entrapment by FBI informants. Now, I hasten to tell you that FBI informants have been used since the beginning of the FBI in terms of infiltrating drug cartels, infiltrating Mexican cartels, infiltrating black gangs, Yakuza, all types of criminal cases and gangs. And yet suddenly, the only time the media raises the issue of informants being a suspect tactic is when it applies to radical Muslims. And that's a sympathy that is artificially placed by sympathizers, witting and unwitting, to radical Islam in the media today. Fortunately, we live in a world where there is an outlet to spread the word beyond the mainstream media. But understand this, when those who define reality are defining it in the same way that our enemies are defining it, we lose the war. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you for an interesting and coherent argument or thesis about a central problem of terrorism in the United States. Thank you so very much. Sir in the rear, would you comment upon immigration and the problem of perhaps
this is beyond
having
my
a number
grade,
of people
but,
who are not necessarily loyal to this particular regime enter?
Well, the irony, of course, is that there is, first of all, has to be acknowledged, a lot of illegal immigration to this country from all over the world. And the Hispanic immigration or illegal immigration poses a different type of challenge to us than Islamic immigration from radical countries, where the radicalism is perpetuated here. Interestingly enough, in Minneapolis 2 years ago, when they discovered a al-Shabaab or Somalian terrorist group operating and sending young Somali kids born here to train in jihad and to carry out terrorist bombings in Somalia and elsewhere, it was the first generation of Somali parents that moved here that protested against the Islamic group's insistence that nobody talks to the FBI. So in fact, what we're seeing here is second generation Somalis, second generation Egyptians, and second generation Kosovans who are involved in spreading the ideology that they're somehow discovering in the United States through the internet, through YouTube, and through the local mosque, which might be teaching the same radicalism. Look, I don't profess to be an expert on immigration, and I know it's a very divisive issue. But I don't think necessarily that if we were to stop all immigration, that all terrorism would stop. I think you have a critical mass in this country already living here that has the potential to cause many problems for us, just as London and Spain and the other European countries have. So am I against illegal immigration? Absolutely. Do I think that's the totality in answering and stopping radical terrorism of any kind? No. It may be part of the answer, but the real answer is discrediting and delegitimizing the groups that are spreading the word that America is the cause of a conspiracy to subjugate Islam.
The general question is, you gave the impression the United States government is not seriously involved in this struggle against the enemy as you describe it, and would you comment on that?
If I made that impression, I was incorrect, and I want to correct it. The U.S. government is very involved, but it depends what part of the U.S. government. There are representatives here from the U.S. government, Harvey Eisenberg from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Ray Orzel from the Department of Homeland Security, who work the same neurotic hours I work, 60 to 70 hours a week, and are dedicated, no matter what administration, to fighting terrorism. Number two, what I criticized, and I should have been more specific, were certain leaders in the administration that I thought were not enforcing or prosecuting anti-terrorism laws as vigorously as they could or has been done, such as the Department of Justice under the leadership of Attorney General Holder, who refuses to use the term radical Islam, or Secretary or the National Security Advisor John Brennan, who lauds the notion of jihad as a wonderful concept, which would lead him to then change the Islamic terrorist group Islamic Jihad to the Union of Good. So there are individuals who I think don't get it, but doesn't mean that they're wholly non-committed to the actual issue of prosecuting terrorists. Because, for example, Attorney General Holder gave a very strong press conference just the other day defending the prosecution of the Oregon would-be bomber, as well as giving out awards to all the prosecutors that were involved in prosecuting the Hamas terrorist funding trial in 2007 and 2008. So it's not a black or white situation. It's a measured situation, and the lower down in the bureaucracy you get, the more uniform dedication you get to fighting terrorism. The higher up you get, the more politicized you get. And that's a general rule in all institutions. So I don't want you to leave the impression that this administration is disengaged from it at all. What I will do is tell you that some members of the administration are not as aggressive as they should be and as called for by the current situation.
If you were to look at the declines of the great civilizations, is there any analogy to the situation either here or in the world today?
I'm afraid that I'm not enough of a scholar to say that I would recognize any commonalities. I don't, when the Islamic Empire fell apart in World War I, it didn't really fall apart. The Islamic Empire still exists, but not in the same format, not in the same role that Turkey played. Kemal Ataturk decided to use incredible force to secularize his country and bring Turkey into the modern world, which basically allowed Turkey to prosper more than any other Islamic country as a true Islamic democracy. As far as the Crusades are concerned, the Crusades were modern-day jihads for the Christians to liberate Palestine from the Christian control, and they were bestial, they were horrible, they were murderous, and I'm not defending them, but I'm saying that we've gotten beyond that, and the Muslim world needs to get beyond that. And you can't invoke the Crusades every single time it's justifying an attack of terror against the United States. Because we could go back even further and say, well, the jihads of the 700s were responsible for these attacks against the West. So I think the bottom line is the short-term memory is fine, but the long-term memory gets us in trouble.
All of you with great questions remaining, I apologize, but it's time for us to end the session. Our guest has been terrific. We thank him very much.